mind just giving a little bit of a background about yourself, how you got involved with MMA and there with the Performance Institute?
Yeah, I mean, it starts a while ago, probably 20, 23, 22, 3 years into this thing now. I mean, I ultimately got my PhD in exercise physiology at the University of Connecticut back in 2004, working with Bill Kramer in exercise physiology and particularly muscle physiology and resistance training and the neuromuscular adaptations to resistance training. I completed my PhD and went back to the UK, where I started to work in an applied field with the English Institute of Sport, which is similar to the USOC. So,
Hmm.
the primary service provider to the GB Olympic teams. And at that point, I worked with multi-sport, a number of multi-sport services. But in particular, I was heading up the support, strength and conditioning support to GB boxing athletes in the northeast of the UK,
Hmm.
as they prepared for the Beijing Olympics. So I spent a lot of time working with boxers as a strength and conditioning coach. Beijing happened, and then I became the head of strength and conditioning for GB basketball. And I was head of GB basketball for 7 years, head strength and conditioning coach with those guys through to the London Olympic Games. And all this time I was also working, lecturing as a adjunct professor at universities and things in the UK. So published and also worked practically in the field. And then I had a couple of seasons in the English Premier League as the head of strength and conditioning to Newcastle United Soccer Club. After that, I went back into the English Institute, where I became the head strength and conditioning coach for GB Taekwondo through to the Rio Olympics. So I've been a strength and conditioning coach primarily for about 20, 22 years. And then became, technical lead for strength and conditioning in the English Institute. So managing about 60 different, coordinating, 60 different S&C coaches around the country, in the UK. And from there, I got recruited to come back to the US by the University of Notre Dame. And that was into the role of Director of Sports Sciences for the whole of athletics,
Hmm.
where I was essentially managing all the support services, strength and conditioning, nutrition, athletic training, psychology, etc., to 27 different teams at Notre Dame. And I was in one of those positions, which is very much kind of a performance director role, if you like, trying to build out high performance systems for an NCAA school. And then I got the call from the UFC that were looking to recruit my current role, which is Vice President of Performance. And, the rest is history. I came across here, and the role is very much in directing support services to the sport of MMA. So, listen, I played around with martial arts over the years as a kid and things like that, but I've never been an MMA fighter myself. But what I have got is pretty extensive experience in combat sports at the Olympic level or above, in terms of working as a strength and conditioning coach to Olympians, where I've coached double Olympic gold medalist in Taekwondo, two world champions in Taekwondo, silver, bronze, two bronze medalists at the Olympic Games in boxing. So that's where my kind of interest and expertise around combat culture and combat sports and preparing athletes for combat sports comes from.
Hmm.
And that was obviously attractive to the sport of MMA and the UFC in particular, because
Yeah.
they're all respective components that go into MMA. So
Right.
that's kind of how I ended up where I am right now.
Okay. Now, the Performance Institute is obviously quite a facility there. So what purpose would you say that the institute serves, and why exactly it was created?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have a global roster of about 570 fighters, and all of the services that we provide are open access to any one of those fighters on our roster. It's a truly global roster.
Hmm.
About half of that number live in North America, and about 27 fighters live in Vegas now. The services are all free of charge. Their expertise. We work remotely. We work in person. and ultimately, I always say we have three primary objectives here in the Performance Institute. Number one is to deliver world-leading expertise and world-class services to support and help the fighters in the services that they might not necessarily be able to get in their own gyms or in their own environments. So we have expertise in strength and conditioning, nutrition, sports science, physical therapy, and basically we provide those services to the athletes free of charge. So that's the first level, is kind of supporting athletes with world-leading standards of care. The second thing which we have an ambition to do is ultimately MMA professionally is only 25 years old, so it's very young as a sport, and we are here to help develop the research and our knowledge and our data insights around the sport of MMA so that we can interrogate it and understand it better. Presently, the research field and literature is pretty small, so we have an obligation to do that, because we've got access to the largest population of world-class MMA fighters anywhere. And then the third part of it, off the back of data collection, is then education to try and drive best practice out in the combat community. So ultimately, through our research and our findings and our kind of philosophical developments here, we then want to educate and provide outreach information to the global community so they go about their preparations in a more appropriate fashion, or with less injury risk, or some more strategy to help optimize performance, health and well-being. So in a nutshell, those are the three levels: service to athletes, research and projects and innovation, and then finally outreach and education.
Okay, gotcha. And what would you say the biggest impact that the Institute so far has made for the fighters?
I mean, ultimately impacting fights. One of the reasons why the UFC Performance Institute came about was because the UFC identified that they were losing main events or co-main events, and fights were dropping off fight cards, and they wanted to try and minimize that occurrence. So they pollinated the idea of, if we have a Performance Institute that can help educate athletes how to prepare or taper or whatever it may be, will minimize the risk of losing athletes. So, we've only been open 16, 17 months now, so in May 2018, 2017, and we can already contest to 19 fights that we've probably saved, that if it wasn't for the Performance Institute, those fighters would have been pulled from the fight. So be it in a nutrition kind of emergency and making weight, or be it through injury and potentially, getting athletes rehabbed faster than they would have done. Impacting fights and saving fights is the biggest influence we had. But we're also obviously giving athletes information and insights that they've never had before around their performance standards and their analytics and their data that we can provide them with, and just education in the community. Every time they come into the facility, or we work with them remotely, and their coaches and their team, we're really kind of hopefully upskilling them, giving them more thoughts around the most optimal way to prepare.
Okay, gotcha. Now, in terms of the training programs for the fight themselves, would you be able to explain a little bit what they generally entail, and whether they're tailored specifically for each fighter?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, the sport of MMA, probably more so than any other sport, has got so many degrees of freedom that we have to account for. We're obviously a weight class sport, so there's many different weight classes. There's men, there's women, there's different stylistic backgrounds, whether you're coming in as a wrestler, a Muay Thai fighter, a Jiu-Jitsu fighter. There's lots of different backgrounds that fighters are coming to the sport of MMA with. Now, when you try and build out a training program for that, you've got to account for all of those things. Now, absolutely, every single one of our programs is written and developed on an individual level, because we can't roll out cookie-cutter programming, unfortunately. Wish we could, but It's a cross we bear. Because if we're writing a program for someone with a wrestling background that needs to develop more explosive striking skills, and then we write the same program for a Muay Thai or Taekwondo fighter that needs ground game, it can't look the same. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So we have customized programming for all of our athletes, and the programming all starts with objective assessment. I always talk about, if you're not assessing, you're guessing.
Hmm.
So when you're trying to be a world champion, guesswork is probably not the most optimal approach to take. So we have a pretty extensive portfolio of objective assessments and diagnostics that we put fighters through. Now, from there, our strength and conditioning staff have got more insights into two things. Number one, X factors. So where does the athlete excel in certain physical attributes or technical skills, and how can we continue to maximize those X factors? So making your strengths super strengths.
Hmm.
But then everything else in terms of programming is about directing your training program to raising the limitations that we've identified. So if we benchmark your performance standards against the rest of the athletes in your weight class, we can now understand which physical attributes are limiting you compared to your competitors, and that's where your program then gets built. The MMA is the decathlon of combat sports, and you've got to be able to be good at lots of things at once. So if there's some low hanging fruit, then there are always going to be the things that hold you back, and that's where we try and direct our programming. So there's strength and power components, there's balance and agility, and there's flexibility, mobility, there's metabolic conditioning, all those things that go into any strength and conditioning program, obviously there.
Hmm.
But it all starts with an insight and an objective understanding of what that specific athlete's physiology looks like.
Gotcha. Now, I remember, you're talking a little bit about the metabolic conditioning part of it. I remember back at the NSCA National Conference, you really emphasized in your presentation there the importance of conditioning. And
Yeah.
so I want to ask, what exactly does conditioning do to separate a good fighter from an elite fighter?
Yeah, again, that's another great question. There's not many fighters that come out of an octagon and say, I lost that fight because I wasn't strong enough or powerful enough.
Hmm.
There's quite a lot that come out of the octagon and say, I've lost that fight because my metabolic conditioning didn't allow me to compete at the energetic rate that my opponent was competing at. So, it's truly a differentiator between higher levels and lower levels. And Lachlan James out of Australia has done some research to demonstrate that particularly around glycolytic energetics, higher performers have better physiological standards than lower level performers. So it differentiates in standards. But at the end of the day, everything you do is about energy cost. It's what's the respective cost of the exercise, and how much money have you got in the bank? How much energy money have you got in the bank saved up? So we do a lot of work around the three primary energy systems because we can essentially create an argument that they're all critical. If you look at alactic physiology, 77% of fights are won in 8 to 14 second high intensity efforts. So that's your flurries of punching, your explosive submissions or your takedowns. Those high intensity efforts differentiate the fight, and well over 3/4 of fights are won in those phases of activity. So we've got to have the ability to produce power fast, energy quickly, alactic wise. If you look at the sport, it is a 5-minute round, and we know anything beyond 2 minutes, becomes heavily aerobically orientated. But again, as you repeat those high intensity efforts across time, there's a large accumulation of lactate, and that has been shown, that energy system has been shown to differentiate standards of fighters. So we've got to prioritize that. And then the aerobic system is largely the recoverability piece. So your alactic and your lactic systems are only going to be as good as your aerobic system is able to resynthesize the energy stores that are utilized in those anaerobic systems. So not so much necessarily about a VO2 max, true anaerobic capacity. There's not a lot of research that shows that is a major differentiator of performance, but the aerobic system is critical from resynthesis and regeneration of anaerobic substrate.
Okay.
So we can create an argument that all of the energetic pieces have got a significant role to play, and that's why it's so critical in a sport, where fighting is pretty relentless for 5 minutes.
Yep, gotcha. Now, which conditioning exercises would you say that you found to be the most effective in preparing fighters?
So one of my big things is it's not necessarily about the exercises you use; it's about the adaptations that you're trying to create.
Okay.
So exercises are simply tools in a toolbox,
Yep.
and this comes back to our objective approach of monitoring and assessment. Physiologically, every strength coach needs to be a biologist. They need to understand physiology and biology because they've got to direct their training in a particular way to bring about a desired adaptation, whether that's an increase in stroke volume or myocardial hypertrophy, whether that's buffering tolerance and the removal of hydrogen ions, or whether that's increased enzymatic, phosphocreatine processing and stores of PCR. You're trying to create very specific adaptations. So we use a ton of different exercises. Obviously, in sport of MMA, it's upper body and lower body, both striking and grappling perspective. So wherever possible, we try and use whole body workouts and whole body demands, be it versa climbers, air dynes, rowers, or just whole body conditioning, resistance circuits with strongman carries, ropes, slam balls. We use a ton of different things, so it's not like any particular exercise is the most effective.
Mm-hmm.
What we want to do is try and replicate the tissue demands of the fight, but then align it to what's the adaptations we're trying to create.
Okay, gotcha. Now,
And that all comes back to the 101 of planning and programming: sets, rest, frequency, intensity, duration.
okay, gotcha. Now, in terms of the men and women fighters, does the programming ever really differ between the two?
Well, it does and it doesn't. I mean, ultimately, the fights are different. So what we've done is we've basically taken every fight since 2002, well over 4,000 fights, and we've looked at the dynamics of the respective fights. And you see difference in fight characteristics between ladies' fights and men's fights. More knockouts in the men's fights, but more decisions and more fights going the full distance in women's fights. So straight away you can suggest that women have to prepare themselves for a longer fight, and that's an energetic conversation. More submissions in women's fights, and again across the weight classes, the heavier weight classes have more knockouts versus the lighter weight classes. So there are very characteristic differences between men and how men win fights and what that looks like, and how the females are winning fights and what their fights look like. So at that level, you got to consider the fight characteristics first and foremost. But then it comes down to the objectivity that I've talked about. Where's the personal limitations, or where's the strengths that we're trying to magnify? And really, it doesn't then differ beyond that. Ultimately, the sport of MMA and in the UFC, the rules, the regulations, the size of the octagon, everything is identical for men and women. So the techniques, the rules, the playing area, it's all the same. And that's not, you look at tennis, men do extra rounds than women. It's different rules. You look at, other sports, the volleyball, field hockey, the different rules for men and women. UFC is exactly the same. So we don't really differ in terms of the way we physically prepare men and women, but it is absolutely directed by fight characteristics and then also that individual level of objectivity.
Okay, gotcha. You mentioned earlier how you're starting to monitor and collect data from fighters and stuff like that. So, which tools do you use for monitoring, and which data have you found to be the most helpful?
Yeah, so I mean, listen, we're blessed here at the UFC Performance Institute with a big investment in technology and assessment capabilities, and we use them extensively. But the opportunity to monitor and assess without massive investment is also there.
Yep.
For people in the out in the grassroots working with local level fighters. So I don't want to say everyone has to do what we do, but we absolutely tap into our technology and our monitoring capabilities. We've got a pretty extensive portfolio of strength power assessments, largely emphasized around force plates. So we can do a series of tests and we can get 4x the amount of data from. So we have 5 or 6 tests where we're getting 4 times the amount of dependent variables that we can interrogate. So force plates. If we do a vertical jump, I can get 15 different metrics from a single vertical jump that's going to give me insight into performance. So we do a lot with force plates. We have we look at velocity-based training. So we'll do a lot of bar velocity assessment. So we look at loaded speed squats and things like that for looking at power outputs. We've got some sport-specific assessments where we'll use the gym aware, where we'll do landmine punch throws and more specific movements. So the strength power diagnostics very much rely on force plates and dynamometers and camera systems like Elite Form. In the metabolic conditioning space, we do a lot on the watt bikes because they have some pretty high caliber applications and inbuilt protocols that we can look at functional threshold power and things like that. And then we use metabolic carts to look at lactate, anaerobic breakpoints and ventilated breakpoints and VO2 maxes. So in our metabolic space, we'll use the metabolic cart, we'll use the watt bike, and we'll use some basic blood biochemistries from lactate and glucose monitoring. And then from a readiness and preparedness kind of concept, we use Omega-Wave is our choice technology. That gives us a real understanding of day-to-day fatigue and readiness to train. And we really believe that's a powerful technology. And then in our nutrition and body composition assessments, we've got whole body DEXA, which is, I'm sure you know, is gold standard for body composition assessment. Mm-hmm. We use the metabolic cart to look at resting metabolic rates and caloric expenditure. We do some basic urinalysis, looking at urine-specific gravity and these things. And then we also have some bioelectrical impedance capabilities. So across the board, diagnostic capabilities, but we don't roll out every single assessment with every single athlete that comes through. Sometimes we do, but again, it starts with a conversation with the athlete and the coach in terms of what are your goals and objectives, and then how can we help you support that, and then our staff will ultimately come together and decide what the best portfolio of service of diagnostics is that we need to undertake.
Okay, gotcha. Now, if somebody was looking to start competing in MMA, in general, they haven't really done much of it. They just want to start kind of training for it. In terms of programming, in terms of lifting and conditioning, where would you recommend they start?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's happening more and more. Obviously, UFC is the fastest growing sport in the world at this moment in time, so more and more people are getting into MMA out there in the community. So happens a lot. I think the easiest way to respond to this question is ultimately, as I've contested to, there are a significant amount of variables that go into being a good MMA fighter. Takedown offense, takedown defense, which are all wrestling moves, submission and grappling skill, which is called jiu-jitsu, the striking components, both upper body and lower body, the grappling piece, the different requirements for our sport are vast. So the physical attributes that go into each of those specific areas is pretty significant. If you think about, there's really 7 main components of our sport: boxing, karate, taekwondo, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, judo, what's the other one I'm missing? Muay Thai. So they're the kind of 7 components that go into our sport, and each one of those alone has got physical attributes that you're trying to pursue. So that being said, I think if you're getting into building out a conditioning or lifting program for MMA, I would advocate a daily undulating strategy. So looking at strength days, power days, endurance days, and obviously adapting the rep ranges and the volumes according to that, and the loads to meet those needs, because you've got to try and develop skills in many different areas. So if you just do a block periodization strategy, it's going to take you too long to develop all the physical attributes that you need. So I think if you're starting out, where you're trying to develop all these physical attributes at once, I'm an advocate of the undulating system, day-to-day undulating approach, where you're placing different focus on a day-to-day basis, and then your conditioning strategy ultimately needs to complement your MMA, conditioning. So MMA, how much MMA am I doing, and what type of MMA am I doing, is always going to be the number one determining factor, and then you build the rest of your conditioning around that. Now, with your conditioning, I come back to the three energy systems, because we've accounted for the value of each of them. And fighters have got to be comfortable with doing high explosive efforts and then resting for significant periods of time to really throw up that anaerobic horsepower. A lot of what happens is fighters feel that they have to do a lot of glycolytic work and just grind through large metabolic sets, and that's not always the best way. So, touching on the aerobic conditioning, the lactate conditioning, also that high quality, high power output stuff, and then building that around your MMA workouts, I think is the best way to go for people starting out. So an undulating strategy on a day-to-day basis, heavy days, moderate days, light days, and then different focuses from a strength day, power day, endurance day. And then you're going to start building the attributes that will give you the skill sets, give you the physical attributes for all of the respective skill sets. Now, as you move up to become more proficient in MMA, it might become more block periodization strategy, where you start to focus on very specific physical attributes that you're trying to build, and you saturate the system with a single system, a single signal. But for people starting out, certainly undulating is the best way to go.